do you run on the authoritarianism itself, or do you run on the price of eggs? I think people who are living paycheck to paycheck probably don't have the luxury of worrying about whether Trump is eroding democratic norms. I think many of them don't, clearly don't. But I think it is a reason why white collar, white voters who might lean Republican on economic issues can be moved to vote against Trump on these grounds too.
Ron, let's talk about what the declining approval rating of President Trump means for Democrats, because there's been so much ink spilled,
Yeah.
figuratively, over Democrats not having their act together, not really understanding how to prioritize what they're going to fight with Trump's actions. So, what do you see as the state of the party right now, just generally, and then we'll get into some specifics.
Yeah. People probably do not have no reason to remember this unless they do this for a living like I do. But in the fall of 2010, on the eve of an election in which Republicans won more House seats than any party had won since 1938, over 60 House seats, right? Democrats lost over 60 seats, got wiped out in the Senate. In the fall of 2010, the Democratic image in Gallup, positive, negative, was more favorable than the Republican image. And yet Democrats got annihilated. Same thing, by the way, in 2014. And they got annihilated. And they got annihilated because midterm elections are fundamentally about the incumbent president. They are fundamentally an opportunity for voters to cast their verdict on the first 2 years of a president. And so I actually think that now, I'll qualify what I'm about to say, but I actually think that the concern about the Democratic image is not really justified for 26. I don't think it's going to be nearly as big a factor in the 26 midterm election as voters' assessment of Trump's first 2 years. I think that is what midterm elections are now about more than anything else. The single most important number in a midterm election is the president's approval rating. And Trump's approval rating was 45% in the exit poll on election day in 2018. And they lost over 40 House seats. Now, where I qualify that is that the party image probably does matter in some statewide races, particularly in red-leaning states where Trump may now be underwater, but voters are deeply suspicious of Democratic candidates. But having said that, even in the Senate races in 2018, Trump's approval was a very good predictor. Where he was over 50, Republicans won in Indiana, Missouri, Florida, and North Dakota. And where he was under 50 in Colorado and Nevada, they lost. The exceptions were those three Democratic incumbents who held on in 50-plus Trump states in Ohio, Sherrod Brown, Montana, Tester, and Manchin in West Virginia. Ultimately, they lost all of those seats. The Democratic image problem is real, and the party, I think, it is going to be a factor in 2028. But I think it can really only be resolved by a presidential candidate. I don't know if there's a way for, quote, Democrats to change the way voters are seeing them while Trump is in the White House. The Democratic image I've written is probably in its worst shape since the end of the Reagan years. And it was really, circling the drain after Bush beat Dukakis in '88. But Bill Clinton won in '92 by redefining the party. And that is going to be necessary for the Democrats in 28, but it is something that a presidential candidate can do, and I think only a presidential candidate can do. So, yeah, I mean, for 26, I mean, Democrats have to keep the focus on Trump, and what Democrats are for is probably less important. The contract with America is not why Republicans won 50 seats in '94. It was because, similar to 2010, voters were rejecting the first 2 years of a Democratic president. The question, of course, will be, as we talked about a little in the pregame, what aspect of Trump should be front and center?
Hi, I'm Pat Morrison, one of the hosts of America at a Crossroads. If you like this video, don't just watch. head over to our website where you can subscribe for early access to new programs, see our upcoming schedules, and connect directly with our guests in our weekly live streams. Thank you for watching.
You have Gavin Newsom, of course, California's governor, who is just responsive to Trump and essentially tries to counter the moves, whether it's going to be Texas redistricting in the middle of the decade, and we'll take to voters an initiative, or legislatively placed proposition, which is going to ask California voters to overturn the independent redistricting commission. It's sort of counterpunch is the Gavin Newsom approach to it. But does that make sense to you from a political standpoint, or is there another approach you think would be more effective?
So interestingly, on the day that Trump sent the National Guard into DC, Nancy Pelosi tweeted, "This is a distraction from his failure to lower prices and his bill that cut Medicaid while funding tax cuts for the rich," right? She said it's a distraction. Newsom tweeted on the same day that this is an ominous step toward authoritarianism, right? Very different. And I think that encapsulates the fundamental debate among Democrats, which is important for people to understand, not unique to Democrats. The experts that I talk to, the people who study Democratic backsliding, have written about it, Ziblatt and Levitsky, Brendan Nyhan at Dartmouth, Susan Stokes at the Democracy Lab at the University of Chicago. They will tell you that around the world, parties that are running against quasi-authoritarian or really fully authoritarian strongman opponents, whether it's Hungary, Turkey, Poland, Venezuela, wherever, they go through the same debate. Do you run on the authoritarianism itself, or do you run on the price of eggs, right? Do you treat the strongman leader as a unique threat, or do you try to beat him through the normal arguments of politics that focus on the day-to-day material concern of voters? There's not a clear consensus in the political science literature which is better, but there is a clear tilt in what ultimately wins out, which is that in most cases, the parties contesting with strongman opponents do run more on the price of eggs than on democracy.
Well, and we saw, Democrats have been running for a long time about Trump being a threat for democracy. When Georgia redid its election laws, it was, this is Jim Crow again, and a lot of that kind of rhetoric that Democrats, and then it ended up more African American voters in Georgia than they'd ever had. But there's this sort of very heated rhetoric that Democrats have used, and it doesn't seem to have worked.
Okay, so as I said, this is not a unique problem. People here watching should not view this as something as a unique failing of Democrats. This is a question that, fair-minded people around the world have wrestled with. I think there is no question, as the Pelosi tweet signifies, that among the congressional leadership of Democrats, whether it's Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries, they want to run on the price of eggs. They want to run on the argument that Trump promised to make your cost of living more affordable, and he hasn't. And if anything, he has made it worse by imposing these tariffs, and especially by withdrawing federal support, cutting Medicaid to fund tax cuts for the rich. That's how Bill Clinton turned around his presidency after that 94 landslide that we talked about. He was in the dumps for all of 95. Nothing he did worked. But when Newt Gingrich passed a budget in the fall of 95 that simultaneously cut taxes and cut programs, Clinton basically was able to revive his presidency and put himself on a glide path toward re-election. Anybody on the audience old enough to remember the phrase M2E2? Larry, you're old enough. Do you remember M2E2?
No.
Medicare, Medicaid, education, and the environment. He basically said, I will protect M2E2, and Republicans are endangering it to cut taxes for rich people. This bill, this one big, beautiful bill, is the first time since that 95 legislation that Republicans have cut taxes and cut spending in the same bill. The 01 and 03 Bush tax cuts and the 17 Trump tax cuts were all sugar, no spinach. It was only tax cuts. They kept the spending cuts far away from it. In fact, they didn't really pursue any spending cuts under those presidents. But because the House conservatives demanded it, they put them together in this bill. And so, you know, the CBO, the Yale Budget Lab, the Penn Wharton budget model have all put out analyses that shows that for most people at 70,000 or below, they are net losers from this bill. They lose more in the cuts and the added debt than they get from the tax cuts. That is what Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer want to run on. I mean, Chuck Schumer is out in New York this week doing what is he? I think he calls it his micro. You know, he's like in Binghamton and Troy and Utica talking about how the Trump agenda cost those communities specifically. That's what they want to do. Now, the problem with that is that there's other stuff. The House is on fire. If you care about democratic norms, the House and democratic accountability, and you wonder whether Democrats are trying to run a traditional election in something that may not look like a traditional election by 26 or certainly by 28, I think there are a lot of Democrats who find that inadequate. And so you have Newsom, Pritzker, Chris Murphy, who are not framing this as a distraction. They are framing this as a legitimate concern in its own right. And I actually think it is a mistake to describe this as a distraction, because I believe that as important as tax cuts and killing climate regulations are, they are not the primary goal of what Trump and the people around him are waking up every day.
But Ron, do you think Americans really think that sending the National Guard to Washington, D.C., that is part of the strategy for the federal government taking over democratic cities? Do you think most Americans believe that?
I think that Schumer and Jeffries are right, that if your goal is to get to 218 House seats and 51 Senate seats, that the way you can maximize your chances of doing that is to focus on Trump's inability to make people's cost of living more affordable and the fundamental values trade-off of cutting programs for the working class to fund tax cuts for the rich. I think they are right that that has the broadest political impact. I think it is wrong to assume and to discuss the movement toward authoritarianism, both because the failure of institutions to resist it is a serious problem, and anything that can be done to kind of stiffen the spine of the institutions conceding to Trump is important. But also, just in a political sense, I do think that argument does resonate with white collar places where Democrats that are now absolutely essential to democratic chances. I mean, I think people do get it. I think people who are living paycheck to paycheck probably don't have the luxury of worrying about whether Trump is eroding democratic norms. I think many of them clearly don't. But I think it is a reason why white collar, white voters who might lean Republican on economic issues can be moved to vote against Trump on these grounds too. So I don't think it's an either or, and I think it's a mistake to call it a distraction, because it's not a distraction.
Next week, Wednesday, of course, 5 o'clock Pacific time, retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel and national security expert Alexander Vindman will be in conversation with Madeline Brand. You know they're going to be talking about Russia and Ukraine. So until next week, from all of us at America to Crossroads, thank you so much for joining us.